In this class we'll deal with corporate governance. Now corporate governance deals with issues related to corporate control and regulation. It's the relationship between the business and its stakeholders. Some elements of the discussion in corporate governance deals specifically with the relationship between the business and shareholders. But we could widen it out to include the relationship between the business, the shareholders, the employees, even the local community. So we need to specify which stakeholders in particular we're dealing with. But really what we're talking about here is the relationship between the business and the stakeholders, and in particular the way in which the business conducts itself ethically. In essence, it deals with ways in which companies are monitored and controlled from abusing their power. Companies have considerable amount of power because of the resources they wield, and therefore they must be controlled, they must be monitored. Many companies may be perfectly ethical in the way they deal with the community and the way they deal with their shareholders, but some may abuse it. And for that reason, all the companies need to be monitored. The managers of businesses have a considerable amount of power because of their expert knowledge of the product, the processes within the business, the relationship of the business with other companies and with the wider community. So the managers have a considerable amount of knowledge and therefore a considerable amount of power. In addition to that, they are not tightly regulated by the shareholders. Shareholders of large corporations tend to be quite dispersed, and therefore they don't come together to exert coherent power or coherent force on the managers to act in particular ways. So for this reason, governments have felt it necessary to have reports commissioned and to take action in the way in which companies operate and report their dealings. Governance rules and procedures are the guidelines by which companies ensure that they act in a manner that is fair and equitable to all their stakeholders. So it's important that companies exercise their power in a responsible fashion. They must be careful about the way they go about their business so as not to act to the detriment of local communities or to the environment, or and also the way they are accountable. They must show that the business is accurately reported. There is a temptation for the managers, because of their power, to give themselves large bonuses and give themselves all sorts of perks, which of course is detracting from the profitability of the business, the reported profitability of the business, which may therefore affect the available funds for distribution to the shareholders, who are, after all, the owners of the business. But also that money that's been taken by the managers could have been used for investment and for job security or for research and development into new products or new processes. So it's important that the managers are controlled and monitored. Companies should articulate and enforce a structure of acceptable principles that cut across all its activities and ensures fairness to all who deal with it. So there should be some sort of transparency. The various stakeholders, including the customers who have an interest in the viability and the continuance of the business, the customers should be aware of, for example, how the products are made and where the resources that are used in the production of the products, where they come from, where they are resourced. It may be that the company is buying raw materials from countries who are paying very low wages to his workers or mistreating their workers. And customers want to know about this. So companies should articulate and enforce a structure of acceptable principles. They should state what they're about and how they behave towards all the stakeholders. And they should have measures in place to ensure that what they say will be acted upon. Companies are expected to identify and specify a range, scope and distribution of rights and responsibilities amongst its different stakeholders. So simply tell the customers what their rights are. If the customers expect to receive a certain product of a certain quality, then that's what they should get. The workers who are employed within the business, they should know what their contracts permit and don't permit, and they should not be abused or mistreated while at work. The environment in which they work should be safe. They should have facilities for rest, and it should be a responsible business. It should not pollute the atmosphere or contaminate the water supply, and if it does, it should clean it up. So companies are expected to identify how they're going to behave within the community. Companies have an ethical responsibility to all the various participants who deal with it. It may not be a legal obligation, but there are ethical principles at play. The company knows that if it pollutes the atmosphere, it will be to the detriment of the health of the local population. So it should take measures not to do that. The pursuit of profit has to be tinged with responsibility to the community and to all of the stakeholders. And on top of all of this, the pursuit of profit itself may mask the fact that the managers are taking out of the business perhaps a disproportionate sum to even the detriment of the shareholders. The shareholders are the owners of the business, and they expect honesty in the reporting of the business and transparency. They should know who's getting what and what everything costs. So managers who conceal their bonuses or their perks are not behaving responsibly to the shareholders. So the need for openness and transparency cuts right across all of the activities of the business. These may include the people who deal with it, may include all the stakeholders, but particular attention is placed on the company's financial dealings and the need for openness and honesty in this area. It's important that the company reports honestly and openly all its financial dealings, so that stakeholders who have an interest in the business and who have a right to see the accounts can get a true and fair picture of the performance of that business. In this respect, we associate corporate governance as applying particularly to the senior management and those responsible for its financial administration. The senior management are the people who can decide what information is revealed or what information is in a sense buried. It's concealed. So the senior management are expected to behave ethically. They're expected to report openly and honestly. And that includes their entitlements and what they have given to themselves in the form of salaries and perks and bonuses. The other and much wider areas of ethical responsibility are usually dealt with under the heading of corporate social responsibility. And that's a big area and an increasingly important area of study within the business community. And it's one that we have got separate videos on, so I'm not going to deal with it here. But there are much wider areas of ethical responsibility that must be considered. And as I said, these come under the area of corporate social responsibility. Corporate governance is therefore related in particular to the corporation's senior management and their probity in financial matters. Now, what this means is that the senior management must be honest in their financial dealings. They must be open and honest. There must be no secret dealings. There must be no theft from the business. They must not run businesses within businesses. They must not misuse the resources of the business. So there's an onus on the senior management in particular to ensure that the business is run honestly and openly and is reported as such, so that the owners of the business, the shareholders, can see exactly what is going on. Those related to issues of corporate governance include the board of directors. Now, the board of directors tends to be appointed by the shareholders, and the reason why there's a board of directors is to try and go between the shareholders on the one side and the senior management on the other. The board of directors are there as checks and balances to try and ensure that the senior management do not behave unethically. They do not misuse the resources of the business. So the board of directors are a check on management, and they're appointed by the shareholders. But there are also corporate governance issues obviously apply to senior managers who are expected to act openly and honestly. The shareholders need to be involved as well, and the shareholders should have reasonable expectations about the business and should ensure that the business is on a course that is both reasonable in the sense that it's achievable, but it's ethical. It's not abusing workers in this country or in other countries. It's not abusing the suppliers. It's behaving ethically and portraying a good image of itself, a positive image of itself in the wider community. Creditors also have a right to know about what the business is up to. The creditors need to be reassured that the business behaves ethically and that if they supply to the business, they will be paid in accordance with the terms that they agreed. There will not be endless disputes or problems about getting paid. But also that the business itself, the reputation of dealing with the business enhances the reputation of the suppliers. The auditors are involved because the auditors must be above it all. The auditors must be professional and present a fair and true picture of the dealings of the business in the accounts, and they must sign off the accounts as independent auditors. In other words, they check the business, they report accurately and honestly what they find, and report this openly to the shareholders and to the various stakeholders of the business, so that there is a check on the business to ensure that it is running fairly and decently. Regulators may also want to know, in the form of, let's say, government regulators who have an interest in the particular product that's been produced. If the company is producing foodstuff, for example, it may be that the regulators need to get involved. The government may need to get involved, or local government may need to be involved to check that the processes within the business do not pose a risk to health, that the management are not taking shortcuts which may be injurious to the consumer down the line. So regulators need to know that the business also acts in a fair and reasonable manner. Corporate governance sets out the rules and procedures for honest and open decision making relating to financial corporate issues. So the point we need to make out of this last point here on the slide is that corporate governance really focuses in on financial corporate issues, whereas corporate social responsibility tends to pick out a lot of the more detailed policies and issues that companies may get involved with. And ensuring corporate social responsibility is there to highlight issues and to ensure that companies are aware of their wider responsibility. But corporate governance tends to focus in on financial issues, and that's one of the key distinctions between the two. Companies, when developing their system of corporate governance, must explain their financial processes and explain how these will be implemented and how they will impact on the wider society, for example, corporate stability and employment. So when a company is drawing up its processes, how it's going to deal with this issue of corporate governance, it must make sure that it's going to report honestly, fairly, openly, but it must also show its impact on the wider society. Companies exist in society because societies tolerate the companies. The companies are allowed to exist. Of course, the companies benefit from this by virtue of being able to make a profit and by supplying the products they wish to supply. And of course the society benefits because we have higher employment and better standards of living as a consequence of having the companies. So there is a meeting of minds between, on the one side, the wider requirements of society, and on the other side, the aspirations of the business. But the business should explain to the community how its policies will improve the society, will improve employability, will improve the skill base and give people more opportunities and bring about greater prosperity within the area. So that's one area where companies need to publicize. The regulatory framework, for example, statutory reporting requirements and financial transparency. Well, companies must, by law, report their accounts. Limited companies must report their accounts on a yearly basis. They must report their accounts, and the accounts must be signed off by professional auditors and accountants, and in this way the government may levy appropriate taxation, but also ensure that there is nothing untoward about the behaviour of the business. So there is a regulatory framework that companies must adhere to. So they must explain their financial processes in terms of their reported accounts, and these must be open, honest, accurate, and reported with the intention of giving a true and fair picture of the activities of the business. The market environment, for example, corporate information in reports, publications and financial returns, will influence shareholders and potential shareholders' behaviour. So it's very important that the business accurately produces figures related to its performance. If it attempts to hide part of its performance for whatever reason, let's say it's not performing very well, but it tries to portray itself as performing very well, and perhaps issues figures which are more flattering than they should be. This may influence the share price of the company, which will in turn lead investors to make bad decisions. They're investing in a company that they think is doing well, when in fact it's not. And that's cheating. That's fraudulent. It's misleading investors. So again, companies must be regulated to ensure that they are behaving responsibly. And that's within the ambit of corporate governance. Now, methods of governance may include monitoring the statements and actions of senior management, for example. So they're monitored to see if there is a consistency between what they say and what they do. It's also important to ensure that the actions of senior management are not to the detriment of the business or of the wider stakeholder community. So it does not adversely affect the reputation of the business in the long run by, for example, management making statements which are not justifiable and later are exposed as such, which may be detrimental to the image of the business and of course to the employees and to the whole community, who may lose the business as a consequence. So there is an onus on senior management to speak fairly, openly and honestly about their business. It's also important to monitor the policies, and in particular policy changes of the company. So it's important that stakeholders understand what the policies of the business are. What's the business trying to do? What direction is it moving? What's its corporate strategy? Where does it want to be in 5 or 10 years' time? And how will it bring about those changes? And will the implementation of the changes be, again, to the detriment of some part of the community or to some of the stakeholders? So again, honesty is required. Honesty and openness and transparency, that's required. The practices of the company, the ways in which it reports its financial dealings, its trustworthiness and openness. So the practices of the company, what the company actually does, needs to be monitored as well. Not just what it says it's going to do, but what it actually does at the moment. So if it says it's doing something and in practice it's not, that needs to be highlighted. The company said it's doing something, it's acting in a certain way, and perhaps it's not acting in that way, then that needs to be highlighted. The stakeholders need to be aware of this. They need to be informed about it. The decisions of the company, the intentions of the business, and openness and full disclosure of all the relevant factors that impinge upon the decision. Now, the decisions of the business are important. They must be consistent with the points above, where it wants to be in terms of its corporate strategy and how it's going to bring that about, but also what it's doing right now and the way it impacts on the wider stakeholder community, the people who are involved and some way related to the business, which could be very wide. It could be just the local community who have to drink the water or breathe the air. So it could be a very wide remit on that particular term. Now, the decisions of the company and the intentions of the business, the openness and full disclosure of all the relevant factors that impinge on the decision. Now, it's important that the business clearly states what its decisions are and what are its intentions. Having a corporate strategy it would suggest that the intentions of the business are set out in the corporate strategy. The business is saying what we intend to do over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's acceptable. However, the statements from senior management and the statements about the business that are issued by the, let's say, the press office in the business, or by the publicity department in the marketing or wherever it is, may colour what is in the corporate strategy. In other words, the intentions of the business may be slightly different to what is in the corporate strategy. It may be that the management are changing their minds slightly about several issues that they have written into the corporate strategy, but they're changing their minds. They don't want to go in one particular direction, they want to slightly change it, they want to tone down one part and increase a different part. So they are modifying the corporate strategy in a sense without changing it. They're modifying it through their statements, and their intentions are becoming more obvious from what they're saying. Now, this needs to be monitored, because in a sense, when the corporate strategy is issued and when people find out where the business wants to be in 5 or 10 years, the community, the wider stakeholder community, will have come to terms with this. But any variation, perhaps just mentioned in statements by the chief executive officer or by the chairman, any statements here which modified even to a small amount should be monitored, because this can ultimately lead to a radical departure from the corporate strategy. So the intentions of the business, as articulated by the senior management in statements to the press or in briefings, these statements may be moving the business in a different direction to what's set out formally in its strategic plan. The ways in which companies deal with their agents and stakeholders need also to be understood. There's an issue about dealing with some agents, and it's particularly important nowadays because of the impact of globalization that we understand the culture within which business operates. Some elements of culture are good, but there are maybe some practices somewhere, financial practices I'm talking about, which are not acceptable. Perhaps the dealings are not as formal as we would expect. We would perhaps like to see the accounts done out properly and audited by professional accountants whose reputation is beyond reproach. But some dealings may be perhaps not so transparent. And it's not just related to international trade. The tendency for this to happen is universal. This could happen within any one country. Perhaps companies find it easier to deal with people and other companies in a very informal manner, which perhaps don't even go through the accounts. So it's important to work out how companies deal with each other, and in particular the issue arises because of the great impact globalization has had on the world, how companies deal across national boundaries. We've seen, for example, companies operating in one country registering their business in a different country so as to avoid taxes. That needs to be exposed and spoken about. They're generating their revenue in one country, generating their profits in one country, and paying their taxes in a different country because the tax there is cheaper. So that needs to be considered. In essence, corporate governance relates to the provision of accurate and open information and the absence of any intention to deceive the stakeholders of the business. So that's how we can see corporate governance. It's the provision of accurate and open information and the absence of any intention. In other words, there's nothing behind the scenes. There's nothing going on behind the scenes that detracts from the openness or from the accuracy that we expect to be provided about the business in formal documentation and in statements that the company issue about its activities. So there's nothing to deceive the stakeholders. And that's the essence of good corporate governance. There's a growing interest in corporate governance following the collapse of some major corporations in the early years of the 20th century. Started in America with some large corporations that failed. And it'll be worth your while perhaps doing some research into the factors that led to these failures and what happened. But it wasn't just in America. It seemed to have started there with some high profile failures, Enron and various companies that went out of business. But there was also collapses in Europe and in the UK, and also growing interest in many practices that ordinary citizens didn't seem to relate to. The banking crisis, when banks overlent and didn't have the resources to meet their obligations to their depositors. That flies in the face of good banking practice, so how could it happen? And some banks had to be bailed out by taxpayers' money, but the same banks pay large bonuses to their staff in the new year. So how can a bank that does not have resources other than, let's say, taxpayers' money, pay large bonuses to its senior staff? Now, voters and citizens of the countries have a right to ask these questions and have a right to expect institutions to behave responsibly and openly. So there are issues that have led to a growing interest in corporate governance. Perhaps the abuses that we're now aware of have always gone on. Perhaps they've always been there, except they were not highlighted. They were not a pressing issue. They didn't cause major problems for ordinary people. Now we're aware of the devastation that these crises can cause. We're more aware of the need for strong corporate governance. Some financial practices within these corporations were fraudulent and misleading regarding the true financial state of the business. To this end, they misled investors in relation to the share price, and they also misled suppliers in their supply chain and employees in planning their financial futures. So many people were affected by these failures back in the early part of this century and since then up to now. So there was an effort at almost concealing the facts, concealing the truth. Sometimes companies who had a problem because of bad investments in one area, they dipped into the employees' pension funds and raided the pension funds, took cash out of it to pay for their bad decisions. That's essentially stealing. It's stealing what people had anticipated was their pension fund to prop up bad corporate decisions. So this type of behaviour was obviously going to come under the microscope from governments. Governments would have to look into what is good corporate governance. governments would have to check how companies behaved to ensure that there was openness and transparency. And the world in which the businesses were trusted had almost been shattered. So that is one of the outcomes associated with the crash, the economic crisis of the early parts of this century. News exposures relating to issues related with insider dealing and later with the banking crisis reinforced the desire to institute robust corporate governance and regulatory guidelines. The idea that businesses could regulate themselves and could be trusted to regulate themselves had been disrupted by the facts. And when the facts were known, it led to a great deal of financial trauma for ordinary people, some of whom lost their homes, lost their investments, lost their pensions. It was a disaster for many people. And to a large extent, it was brought about through the lack of strict corporate governance. So that takes us down to many countries now have mandatory reporting requirements. And that's where we've got to. We've now got to a state where the companies, the corporations, in a sense, cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted to regulate themselves. There are mandatory reporting requirements in many countries, and companies must show clearly, openly and honestly their financial dealings. So corporate governance has now become a legal requirement, not one which was expected from good behaviour. That's all we're going to deal with here, so let's leave this talk on corporate governance and say thank you for watching.